So in my latest video titled An Ontology of a First Cause, I laid out what I consider to be my blueprint for thinking about an ultimate causal origin of some global causal sequence. But in my case there had no theistic or non-theistic flavor, it was just a neutral picture of the necessary conceptual background for thinking about causal origins. What I managed to work out there was the following. Every causal sequence begins with a non-temporal state, and the initial non-temporal state brings a subsequent temporal state into existence from which the temporal order proceeds. I define non-temporal state as any state as n that does not cause or bring about the existence of some subsequent state as n plus 1, such that as n plus 1 is temporally posterior to as n by some kind of metaphysical necessity. So any world state of which it is true that it might remain in existence wholly without change occurring is to be classified as non-temporal state. If it's possible for such a state to remain wholly unchanged, even though de facto it does cause some subsequent state, it is still considered to be timeless, since all the relevant truth makers, in other words, everything intrinsic or about that state, is identical in case it remains in existence and no change occurs. Whether or not such a state remains in existence unchanged or causes some subsequent state, it is the exact same state. And if we agree on the trivial notion that it is a timeless state if no change occurs and it remains in existence wholly static, then we should accept its timelessness in the latter case. For, once again, the states are not numerically distinct, they are identical. A temporal state, then, is any state as n that does cause or bring about the existence of some subsequent state as n plus 1, such that as n plus 1 is temporally posterior to as n by some kind of metaphysical necessity, meaning a state that all by itself necessitates the occurrence of change and cannot remain unchanged or static. The advantage of this account is that it demystifies the whole notion of a causal origin, for the timeless cause does not exist simultaneous with its effect, the first temporal state. It can simply exist prior to the first temporal state without any dangers to the internal coherence of the proposal. The question remains, though, if there is some initial non-temporal world state as n, such that it does cause the existence of some subsequent state as n plus 1 without any kind of metaphysical necessity, does this have theologically interesting implications? So, if we can truthfully state that it was wholly metaphysically possible for the world state Wt equals 0 equal to S1 to remain in existence without change occurring, and yet S1 caused S2 to come into existence, is this account of the ultimate causal origin of some sequence equally compatible with a quasi-mechanistic naturalist framework, or does it fare better with a theistic agent-based framework? Now, let us take a closer look at S1, our supposed timeless state. Broadly speaking, there are two scenarios that are possibly instantiated. A. S1 remains in existence and no change occurs, or B. S1 brings S2 into existence. Now, given a naturalistic framework, it stands to reason that an intelligible account of the causal origin that involves the state S1 and its causal operations is based on a quasi-mechanistic, albeit indeterministic, understanding of causal operations. So if A and B are mutually exclusive events that possibly occur, each of them will occur given a certain probability. So let's say A occurs given a certain probability P, and B does given a certain probability 1 minus P, since the two options are supposed to be exhaustive. Now, that would, in principle, be a nice way to rationalize as n's causal potentials, but there's a certain problem with this account. It is incoherent. For suppose by chance, given the probability P, A occurs and B doesn't occur, S1 remains in existence, no change occurs. But then, since S1 has remained wholly unchanged, it's possible, given the probability 1 minus P, that B occurs and S1 brings S2 into existence. But now, suppose again that by chance, given the probability P, A occurs and B doesn't occur. S1 remains in existence as it is, no change occurs, but then, again, since S1 has remained wholly unchanged, it's again possible, given the probability 1 minus P, that B occurs and S1 brings S2 into existence, and so on, and so on, and so on, and so forth. It's like a circuit diagram where one arrow leads back to its own origin, which means that, necessarily, given a naturalistic probabilistic framework, B will occur. So any state as n that is supposedly non-temporal really is just a temporal state, for it cannot remain in existence unchanged. For suppose it does remain unchanged, there is always some probability of such state causing a subsequent state. The circle never comes to rest. The proposal of some state as n possibly, though not necessarily, remaining in existence unchanged is incoherent given a naturalistic, quasi-mechanical framework. Yet, if we therefore infer that an agent-causal account faces the same analogical problem, we fallaciously infer that possibilities translate into probabilities. For let us suppose that Sn is a state that is exhaustively described by positing an agent as existing, that has a causal potential to bring about some subsequent state Sn plus 1, but is also free to remain wholly inactive. Let us suppose that S is free in a libertarian sense, so that it holds that S is free with respect to state of affairs x at time t, since at t S is able to bring about x and S is able to bring about not x. For in this case it holds that an agent S is free with respect to state of affairs x at time t, if and only if at t S is able to bring about x and S is able to bring about not x. So in Sn, there exists some agent S that is free to causally bring about some state Sn plus 1 distinct from Sn, and S is free to refrain from any action, and is therefore free to remain unchanged in its original state, that is, Sn. Now, there are admittedly accounts of libertarian free will that do attribute objective probabilities to various outcomes reflecting on the choices of some agent in question. And yet, there are accounts of libertarian free will based on fixed counterfactuals of freedom, such that we can state, given the set of circumstances C of the actual world W, agent S is free with respect to a state of affairs X if and only if, given C, S is able to bring about X and S is able to bring about not X, and it holds that given C and W, S will bring about X. This account upholds the libertarian account of distinct possibilities while adhering to the truth of a fixed counterfactual. In other words, even though, given libertarianism, there are multiple life options on the table, the relevant agent in question acts in a way that is not chancy, but strictly fixed. As for example Van Inwagen showed with his famous rollback argument, a chancy outcome given repeated libertarian choices that brings about the convergence towards certain objective probability distributions is unsatisfying. One may even suspect that such an account of libertarian free will renders the whole notion of freedom unintelligible and may collapse into mere impersonal chanciness. The theist proposal here pictures S as the self-determining divine essence that freely chooses to bring about the subsequent temporal state as n plus 1, even though, for such essence, it is perfectly possible to remain wholly inactive. This way, there aren't any objective probabilities that correspond to the events A and B, they simply correspond to the capabilities of the divine essence and embody real possibilities, not probabilistic outcomes.